The laughter started before he even reached the third name. That was the part no one talked about afterward, not the silence that followed, not what the arbiters did when he finally stopped speaking, not even what was found in the deep archive files 3 weeks later when someone thought to cross-reference the list against Confederacy military records. No, what haunted the witnesses who were there, the ones who could still sleep, was the laughter, the way it filled the chamber, the way it felt completely reasonable at the time. His name was Corporal Davin Rowe, and he was not an impressive-looking man. That was the first misunderstanding, and it would not be the last. He stood at the center of the arbitration floor of the conclave vessel Patience of Stars, a hall designed to make petitioners feel small, with its vaulted obsidian ceiling and its curved tiers of alien observers rising in concentric arcs overhead, each species given their own section, their own atmospheric bubble, their own interpreters. The hall could seat approximately 400 sentient beings. That day, it held closer to 600. Word had spread that something unusual was scheduled. A human soldier had formally requested the right to speak during the Tribunal of Earned Standing. No human had ever done this before. The Tribunal of Earned Standing was an ancient Confederacy institution, one of the oldest legal mechanisms still in use. It was the procedure by which a member species, or, in extraordinary circumstances, a single representative could formally challenge a classification, a ranking, a decision made about them by others. To invoke it, you had to present your record. You had to list your kills, not metaphorically, literally. The Confederacy's founding species, the Veltian, tall and pale and possessed of a collective memory that stretched back 11,000 years, had built the tribunal around the concept of demonstrated consequence. You did not argue your worth. You did not present credentials or testimonials or philosophical treatises on your value. You listed what you had ended, what you had been willing to end. The number, the nature, the context. The arbiters, 5 senior Veltian whose combined age exceeded most human civilizations, would listen, weigh, and render a classification. Humans had been classified as Tier 3 emerging, protected but unvoted, represented but not heard, present in the Confederacy the way a child is present in a courtroom, technically there, technically considered, never actually consulted. Davin Rowe had filed the formal request alone. No ambassador, no legal counsel, no support delegation. That was the second misunderstanding. The Confederacy's diplomatic liaison to the Human Provisional Authority, a Veltian administrator named Siren Vel, who later testified extensively about what happened, had attempted 3 times to explain to Rowe that the tribunal was not intended for individual petitioners of his standing. She had used the word standing in the Veltian sense, which meant something closer to social mass, the accumulated weight of one's position in a network of obligations and recognitions. Davin Rowe, by Veltian calculation, had almost none. He was a corporal. He was 29 years old. He had no documented lineage of significance, no titles, no prior Confederacy recognition. She had explained this carefully. Twice. The third time she stopped, because something in the way he looked at her made the explanation feel wrong, though she could not have articulated why. He said simply, "I have the right. I read the founding documents." She checked. He was correct. The Tribunal of Earned Standing could be invoked by any sentient being capable of presenting a record. There was no minimum social mass requirement. The founders had apparently considered this unnecessary, since the record itself would speak to standing. The assumption, baked into 11,000 years of institutional design, was that anyone without sufficient standing would simply have an insufficient record. No one had considered what would happen if those two things came apart. Siren Vel granted the petition. She admitted later that she expected it would be a brief and somewhat embarrassing proceeding. She expected it might be useful, actually, a demonstration to the Human Provisional Authority of why the tribunal was not the appropriate venue for their grievances, a gentle institutional lesson. She attended personally. She was seated in the Veltian tier, 3rd row, when Davin Rowe walked to the center of the floor. He was not tall. He was not scarred in any dramatic way. He wore his military uniform, undecorated, because the Confederacy's registration system had not yet processed human military citations into its recognition framework, so technically he had no decorations to present. He carried a single data tablet. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long time being very quiet in places where noise was fatal, and he waited for the arbiters to acknowledge him. Lead arbiter, a Veltian named Voreth Kess, who had presided over 11,000 tribunals across 800 years of personal service, looked down at him from the central dais with the expression of patient sufferance that very old and very important beings reserve for proceedings they consider formalities. "Petitioner," Voreth Kess said, "you may present your record." Davin Rowe looked down at his tablet. He began to read. The first name was a Scarith combat drone designation. A machine. Several observers in the upper tiers exchanged glances. Machine kills did not typically count toward tribunal records. They were considered logistical rather than consequential, but no one interrupted. The procedure required the arbiters to hear the complete record before rendering any judgment. The second name was another drone designation. Then a third. By the fourth entry, a low murmur had begun in the upper tiers. Not hostile, more puzzled. The Veltian observers were doing what Veltian observers always did: comparing, calculating, contextualizing. 4 drone kills was not an unusual record for a soldier of any species. It was, in fact, a somewhat small record for a tribunal petition. Even minor Grath warrior candidates typically presented dozens of organic kills. The fifth entry was different. Rowe read it in the same tone he'd used for the others: flat, precise, almost administrative. It was a Scarith brood captain, an organic commander, a being of significant standing in the Scarith hierarchy. There was a small adjustment in the chamber's attention, a slight shift. Then he kept going. The 6th entry, the 7th, the 8th, all Scarith, some drones, some organics. Voreth Kess was watching him with the particular stillness of a very experienced being who has just noticed something that doesn't fit a pattern but hasn't yet decided what to do about it. By the 15th entry, the laughter had begun. It started in the Grath section, of course it did. The Grath were the warrior culture species of the Confederacy, large and bronze-plated and possessed of a very specific sense of humor about combat records. They had a tradition called the counting of bloods, and they recognized this procedure as a spiritual cousin to it, and they had very clear ideas about what a proper record looked like. A single human, a corporal, reading off kills one at a time, slowly, methodically. It was, to a Grath, almost comedic, like watching someone carefully count their pocket change in a hall built to weigh fortunes. The laughter spread. Not cruel laughter, amused laughter, the laughter of an audience that has realized the performance is unexpectedly entertaining in an unintentional way. Several of the Veltian observers allowed themselves small, controlled expressions of the same sentiment. Even some of the diplomatic aides in the lower galleries were smiling. Davin Rowe did not look up. He kept reading. Entry 22, Entry 30, Entry 38. The laughter began to thin somewhere around Entry 45, not because it had been officially suppressed, but because something in the chamber's mathematics had started to shift. The Grath, who understood combat records more intuitively than anyone else in the room, had been unconsciously doing arithmetic. And the arithmetic was behaving strangely. Entry 50, Entry 57. The Grath section went quiet first. Then the Veltian murmuring dropped away. The chamber didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in stages, species by species, tier by tier, like a fire being carefully extinguished from the outside in, until the only sound in the hall of 600 beings was the flat, measured voice of Corporal Davin Rowe reading names. He had not changed his tone. He had not slowed down or sped up. He read each entry with the same precise, unhurried diction he'd used for the very first drone kill, as if they were all equally important, as if the list were a document that deserved the same respect at Entry 68 that it had deserved at Entry 1. Entry 70. S. Siren Vel later wrote that she began feeling something she had no precise word for in Veltian. She described it as a sound beneath hearing, a vibration in the concept of the situation. She had attended hundreds of tribunal proceedings. She had seen warriors of legendary standing present their records. She had watched Grath Blood Masters recite kills that made younger soldiers weep. She had heard the arbiters sit in silence for 20 minutes after a particularly significant record, simply absorbing it. She had never felt what she felt in that chamber. Entry 81. She realized, around entry 85, that she had stopped breathing in the way she normally breathed and had shifted to the shallow, careful respiration that her species used in situations of threat. Her body had made a decision her mind was still catching up to. Entry 90. Voreth Kess had not moved in several minutes. He was watching Ro with an expression that Siren Vel recognized, with some confusion, as the expression Veltian elders wore when confronting a philosophical problem that invalidated a previously certain position. She had not seen that expression on Voreth Kess in the 11 years she'd worked in proximity to the arbitration floor. She hadn't been sure he still had the capacity for it. Entry 97. Here is what no one in the chamber had yet understood, because no one had yet asked the right question. How long had Davin Ro been a soldier? He was 29. He had enlisted at 18. 11 years of service. The Scarith War, the cold, grinding, relentless border conflict that the Confederacy had been managing, containing, and slowly losing for 30 years, had been his entire adult military life. He had never known a posting that wasn't the border. He had never served in peacetime. But no one had asked that question yet because no one had thought to ask it. The record was being processed as a number, and the number was still climbing, and the climbing was the only thing that existed in the room. Entry 104. One of the Grath in the upper tier, a senior warrior elder named Vask Toran, who had a counting of bloods that stretched to 63 and who had been considered exceptional by his species, stood up. Not to speak, not to protest or object. He simply stood up in the way his culture reserved for acknowledging a peer. It was involuntary. He said afterward that he hadn't decided to do it. Entry 112. Several others in the Grath section stood with him. Still no one spoke. The standing was the only thing they had to offer. It was the most significant thing they could have offered, and in the Grath cultural framework it was not given lightly, and it was not given to beings of other species, and it had never in recorded Grath history been given to something that called itself a corporal. Entry 119. Voreth Kess broke procedure. He had not broken procedure in 800 years of service. He raised one hand, the Veltian gesture for pause, and said, very quietly, "Petitioner. What is the total count of your record?" Davin Ro looked up for the first time since he'd begun. "I haven't finished yet," he said. The arbiter lowered his hand. Entry 127. Siren Vel wrote that this was the moment she understood that she had fundamentally misread the situation from the beginning. Not just today, not just the petition. She meant the years prior. She meant every conversation she'd ever had with human representatives in which she'd explained, patiently and carefully, how the Confederacy worked, and they had listened and nodded, and she had understood their listening as comprehension, as agreement, as acceptance of the framework. She had not understood that they were doing something else. She didn't yet know what they were doing, but she knew it wasn't what she'd thought. Entry 135. The Tribunal of Earned Standing had, in 11,000 years, seen records of varying sizes. The highest officially recorded count in the archive was a Grath War leader named Scorith Vel, who had presented 207 kills across a 40-year campaign and been elevated immediately to full allied standing with voting rights for his lineage. It was the number that defined the upper threshold of what the tribunal expected to process. It was not a commonly reached threshold. Most petitioners presented between 30 and 80, entry 141. It is important to understand that Davin Ro's record was being read chronologically, earliest first. He had started with the beginning of his service, entry 148. He was 29. He had been a soldier for 11 years. He was not yet halfway through his career. Entry 157. No one in the chamber had done this calculation yet. Siren Vel did it at entry 162, and the result made her go completely still in a way that alarmed the Veltian administrator seated beside her, who quietly asked if she was experiencing a medical episode. She was not experiencing a medical episode. She was experiencing the specific cognitive destabilization that comes from realizing that a framework you've used to understand a situation was not just incomplete but structurally wrong. Like standing on a floor and discovering the floor is also a ceiling. Like looking at a horizon and understanding, for the first time, that you cannot see what's behind you. She had classified humans as Tier 3 emerging for 8 years. She had believed this classification generously. She had, in private documents that would later become very uncomfortable reading, described humans as a species of significant emotional capacity but limited strategic depth, beings who felt deeply and endured patiently, but who had not yet developed the institutional sophistication to translate those qualities into effective long-term power. She had believed this because she had looked at the 11 years of the Scarith border conflict and seen humans losing. Slowly, stubbornly, but losing. Ground ceded, populations evacuated, outposts abandoned. She had read the casualty reports and seen the numbers, high numbers, too high, numbers that a rational civilization would have used as evidence that the strategic position was untenable. She had not understood that losing ground is not the same as losing a war. She had not understood that a species capable of sustaining those casualty numbers while remaining in the field was not losing. It was doing something that she didn't have a word for, because in 11,000 years of Velshan history, her species had never encountered a civilization that would sustain those casualty numbers while remaining in the field. Entry 169. The chamber had stopped being a place where diplomatic decorum operated normally. The arbiters were all watching Ro now with the focused, unblinking attention that Velshan reserve for information they consider existentially important. The Grath were still standing. Some of them had moved closer to the gallery railing. In the Keth section, a species of small, mathematically brilliant beings who served as the Confederacy's primary logistical analysts. Several members had opened computational devices and were running what appeared to be probability models. Entry 178. A Keth analyst later identified as Provisional Analyst Thexoa transmitted a brief message to the senior Keth observer during Entry 183. The message was encrypted, but a fragment was later recovered during the post-proceedings archive review. It read in translation, "The rate does not decrease over time. I expected it to decrease over time. It does not. It increases." Entry 189. This was the thing. This was what the chamber was slowly, collectively, catastrophically understanding. Davin Rowe's kill rate was not the flat line of a competent soldier maintaining consistent effectiveness across a career. It was a slope. It was an upward slope. He had been a better soldier at 25 than at 20, a better soldier at 27 than at 25. Each year of the war had made him more capable, not less. Each loss, and the human border forces had suffered extraordinary losses, had made him more effective. Not despite the losses, in some way that none of the beings in the chamber could quite articulate yet, because of them. Entry 197. There was a thing happening in the chamber that no tribunal proceeding had ever produced in 11,000 years, which was that the audience was becoming afraid. Not of Davin Rowe specifically. He was standing in the center of the floor reading numbers from a tablet, which is not, visually, a terrifying thing. They were becoming afraid of the shape of the thing the numbers were describing, afraid of what it implied, afraid of the question that kept pushing itself to the front of every mind in the room. How many of these are there? Rowe had not been chosen for this petition because he was exceptional. He had not been selected from a pool of candidates as humanity's finest military representative. He had filed the petition himself, alone, because he had read the founding documents and found a mechanism and used it. He was a corporal. He was not a decorated champion. He was not a war hero in any official sense. The Confederacy's recognition system had never processed human citations, so officially he was an undecorated corporal of no particular standing. He was just a man who had been fighting a war for 11 years, and if he was just a man, an ordinary soldier, a corporal, a nobody from the border, then what did the other ones look like? Entry 206. Voreth Kess did something that no arbiter had done in the history of the tribunal. He stood up from the dais. He did not call for a recess. He did not signal pause. He simply rose very slowly, with the gravity of a being who has arrived at a decision of extraordinary weight, and he stood. The other four arbiters looked at him. Then, one by one, they rose as well. All five arbiters standing during an active tribunal record was, technically, a breach of procedure so significant that it didn't appear anywhere in the procedural documents because no one had ever needed to forbid it. It was like having a rule against breathing water. It simply wasn't a category of event that had required regulation. Davin Rowe did not look up. He kept reading. Entry 213. He had, by this point, been speaking for 4 hours and 17 minutes. He had not paused for water. He had not asked for a break. Several observers had needed to leave the chamber for atmospheric or biological reasons and had returned. The Keth analyst Thexoa had transmitted 6 more encrypted messages and, according to later testimony, had stopped speaking to colleagues entirely and was simply staring at Rowe with an expression her species rarely displayed. Entry 221. S. Siren Vel realized something else at this point, something that rearranged everything. She had been focused on the number. Everyone had been focused on the number. But she suddenly became aware viscerally, the way awareness sometimes arrives not as thought but as sensation, that Rowe had not looked at his tablet in quite some time. She watched him carefully. His eyes were lowered toward the tablet, but they weren't moving. He wasn't reading. He was reciting. He had the list memorized. Every entry, every designation, every species classification, every contextual notation. He was looking at the tablet because it was protocol to present a documented record, but he was not reading from it. He already knew it, all of it. He carried it in his memory, complete and continuous, every name and designation in perfect order. S. Siren Vel later tried to explain to colleagues why this was the moment that broke something in her understanding. Not the number, not the rate. The memorization. The fact that he had taken this list, this long, still growing list of things he had ended, and he had kept it, deliberately, carefully, not in a file, not in a database, in himself. She asked herself why a being would do that. She didn't have an answer. She didn't think the answer was something she was equipped to reach. Entry 230. A sound came from the Grath section that S. Siren Vel had never heard before. She turned toward it reflexively. What she saw was Vask Toron, the elder warrior who had been standing since entry 112, with his head lowered, not in shame, not in submission, in something that looked with significant cross-cultural translation uncertainty like grief. She understood then that the Grath were not standing because they recognized a warrior equal to their own tradition. They were standing because they recognized something they had no tradition for. Entry 238. Rowe had reached the end. He stopped. The silence was absolute, not peaceful silence, not the comfortable silence of a proceeding reaching its natural conclusion, the kind of silence that exists in the moment after something irreversible has happened, before anyone has decided what to do next. He said, 241 confirmed, 14 additional unconfirmed due to environmental conditions at time of engagement. I can provide contextual documentation for each if required. No one spoke. I'm 29, he said. I have 11 years of service remaining to standard contract. He let that sit in the chamber, then. I'm asking for Tier 1 allied standing, not for myself, for my species. Voreth Kess, still standing, very slowly sat back down. He looked at the other arbiters. They looked at him. The exchange that happened between 5 beings who had collectively lived for over 3,000 years in that look lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The lead arbiter said, "Petitioner, you understand that Tier 1 allied standing carries not only voting rights but mutual defense obligations. The Confederacy would be obligated to commit resources to human conflicts." "Yes," Rowe said. "You understand that this is not a one-directional reclassification." "Yes," Voreth Kess paused. "You would be asking for the Confederacy to formally enter the Scarith conflict on the human side." "Yes," Rowe said. "But that's not why I'm asking." Another pause, longer. "Then why are you asking?" Davin Rowe looked up fully for the first time since he'd begun. He met the arbiter's gaze, an act of significant cultural weight in Veltian interaction, usually reserved for profound formal moments, and he said, "Because we're going to finish it regardless, I wanted you to have the option to be on the right side when we do." The chamber produced a sound that no one in attendance later knew how to describe. It wasn't a reaction in any simple sense. It was something closer to the sound of a collective model of reality undergoing structural revision. The Keth analyst Thexoa transmitted one final message to her superior. This one was not encrypted. It appeared in full in the post-proceedings public record. It read, "I have revised my probability models. Please disregard the previous 6 transmissions. The variables I was using were wrong. I was measuring the wrong thing. We have been measuring the wrong thing." It would be 3 days before Siren Vel requested access to the full human military archive. She had to submit 3 separate formal requests before the Confederacy's Information Bureau processed the clearance, because the Bureau's intake system couldn't initially parse why a diplomatic liaison would need access to military combat records outside her species' jurisdiction. The system had not been designed with this use case in mind. The archive, when she accessed it, was extensive. She had expected to find records for the human border forces, the units that had been in contact with the Scarith for the 30 years of the conflict. She did find those records. They confirmed and amplified everything the chamber had experienced. The casualty rates were extraordinary. The persistence was extraordinary. The individual effectiveness ratings were, across the board, in ranges the Confederacy classification system struggled to process, because the ranges had been built around a dataset that did not include human soldiers. That was disturbing, but it was not what broke her. What broke her was a different section. A section she found while following a cross-reference link, almost accidentally, at 2 in the morning on her 3rd day of research. It was the medical archive. She sat alone in her office, in the blue-gray light of her terminal, and she read the medical archive for the human border forces, and somewhere around the 4th hour she put her work down and sat very still for a very long time. The human soldiers at the border had injury rates that were, by any Veltian medical or military standard, incompatible with continued field service. Not occasionally. Consistently. Across the 30-year record, human soldiers had been returning to active service after injuries that the Confederacy's medical framework classified as service-ending. Not sometimes, routinely, as policy. The documents described in the flat, bureaucratic language of military medical administration human bodies that had been broken and repaired and sent back, over and over. The records contained in the margins notes from human medical officers, not Confederacy-assigned physicians, but the humans' own that read as logistical documentation. Fractures, burns, soft tissue damage, neural trauma, return to duty timelines. The timelines were, by any framework she had ever been trained in, impossible. And then she found the psychological assessments. She had expected, based on everything she believed she understood about the biological and psychological realities of sustained trauma exposure, to find records of beings in psychological collapse. Instead, she found something she could not initially categorize. The assessments described soldiers who were different after sustained exposure. Changed, yes, but not broken, or not only broken. The assessors, human psychologists, using their own frameworks, used language she had to consult a xenolinguistics database to parse. Words like integration and purpose consolidation and survivor orientation. They described a process by which sustained exposure to extreme loss produced, in a significant percentage of human soldiers, not incapacitation but what one assessor called a form of clarity unavailable by any other path. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about Davin Rowe standing in the chamber with his list memorized. She thought about the slope of his kill rate. She thought about the Grath Elder with his head bowed. She thought about the fact that Rowe had filed the petition alone. No ambassador, no legal counsel, no support delegation. And she thought, for the first time, really thought about what it meant that he had read the founding documents and found the mechanism, that he had known about the tribunal, that he had prepared. That the list had been memorized, which meant the preparation had been long. She asked herself, how long had he been planning this? And then a worse question arrived. Was this quiet, methodical, impossibly patient act of preparation, was this what humans looked like when they were being strategic? She had spent 8 years explaining to human representatives how the Confederacy worked. She had thought of herself as a patient teacher. She had thought of them as careful students. She began, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, to consider the possibility that she had it exactly backward. The tribunal's ruling came 6 days after Rowe's presentation. Tier 1 Allied standing, granted unanimously. The ruling document later analyzed extensively by Confederacy legal scholars who couldn't entirely agree on whether it was precedent-setting or procedurally irregular or both, contained one line that had no precedent in 11,000 years of tribunal history. It appeared in the section where the arbiters traditionally noted the basis for their decision. Vorath Kess wrote, "The petitioner presented a record consistent with standing. We note that this represents one soldier, 11 years, and an incomplete career. We have considered what that implies. We have found no classification adequate to what it implies. We are granting the request because the alternative is to pretend we did not hear the record. We cannot do that." Davin Rowe was asked, in the small chamber behind the arbitration floor where post-hearing administrative matters were handled, if there was anything he needed before he was processed for return transport. He asked for a glass of water. The administrative aide, a young Veltian who had worked the tribunal for 4 years and who had been present for the entire proceeding, brought it. She reported afterward that her hands were not quite steady when she handed it to him, and that she was embarrassed by this, and that she remained embarrassed by it when she thought about it later, but that she could not entirely explain how to stop. Rowe drank the water, set the glass down on the small table with the careful, deliberate placement of someone accustomed to operating in conditions where carelessness has consequences, looked at the aide, said, in a tone that was simply conversational, "Thank you." She said, "Can I ask you something?" He waited. She said, "The list, every name, you had it memorized. Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone forming a polished answer, the quiet of someone pulling up something they've lived with for a long time and deciding how much of it to hold out for another person to look at. "Because if I'm going to end something," he said, "I should know its name. I should carry that." She thought about this later. She thought about it for weeks. She shared it with Essiren Vel, who added it to the archive file she had been building quietly since the night of her research session. The file was not an official document. It was personal. It was titled in Veltian with a phrase that translated roughly as "what we did not understand." It grew over time. The Confederacy entered the Scareth conflict 6 weeks after the ruling. The entry was militarily decisive in a way that the Confederacy's strategic command modeled and then remodeled because the initial models didn't produce sensible outputs. The problem was that the human forces, now with Confederacy logistical and technological support, did not operate the way the models expected. The models expected that support would allow the human border forces to stabilize their current lines and begin a methodical territorial recovery. This was how wars were won in every documented case in Confederacy military history. You stabilized, you recovered, you negotiated from a position of strength. The human forces did not stabilize, they accelerated. They had been at the edge of what their own support infrastructure could sustain for 11 years. They had been operating, the Confederacy strategists realized, examining the records at a level of intensity that their own doctrine classified as unsustainable, for 11 years. Without resolving the contradiction between what their doctrine said was possible and what they were doing. When Confederacy support arrived, it did not provide relief. It provided capacity. The humans immediately applied that capacity not to reduce the intensity of their operations but to increase it. They went faster, pushed harder, drove deeper into Scareth-held space than anyone in the Confederacy Strategic Command had projected as realistic for at least 3 years. The Scareth collapsed in 11 months, not militarily initially, psychologically. The Scareth were not a species without courage or tactical intelligence. They had been fighting the human border forces for 30 years and had held their own in a grinding, territorial way across the entire conflict. They understood soldiers. They understood war. What they did not understand, what broke them at the command level before a single major engagement in the final phase, was the pattern. A Scarith Commander scholar captured in the final weeks of the conflict was interviewed extensively by Confederacy intelligence. His account of the command-level psychological collapse was recorded and later classified at the highest level, though fragments appeared in academic publications. He said, "We thought we were winning. For 30 years we thought we were winning. We had the numbers. We had the territory. We were grinding them down. And then we understood, I don't know when exactly. Somewhere in the 30 years. We understood that they knew that too. They knew we had the numbers and the territory, and they kept coming. And we realized, and this is the thing that broke the command, we realized that it didn't matter to them. The calculation that we were winning didn't change what they did. They were not responding to the same mathematics we were. They were not operating in the same logic. And when you fight something that doesn't respond to the logic you're using, that just continues regardless. You cannot maintain the psychology necessary to continue yourself." He paused in the recording. He said, "You cannot fight something that you don't understand well enough to fight." Siren Vel read that transcript in her office. She read it twice. She added it to the file that was not an official document, in the folder she had labeled what we did not understand. She sat for a while. She thought about Davin Rowe. She thought about him standing in the chamber, not reading from the tablet because he already knew the list. She thought about him at 22, at 25, at 29, building that list, carrying it, each entry added to something he maintained not in an archive but in himself. She thought about what it meant to carry that, what it cost, what it did to a person. She thought about his kill rate increasing over time. She thought about the medical records. She thought about the AIDS question and his answer, because if I'm going to end something, I should know its name. I should carry that. She thought about a species that had spent 30 years losing ground, bleeding, watching its people fall, and had not stopped, had not negotiated from desperation, had not traded territory for peace, had not, at any point in 30 years, looked at the mathematics and concluded that the mathematics required them to stop, and had instead sent one soldier, a corporal, a nobody, an undecorated 29-year-old with 11 years of service remaining on his contract, to stand in the oldest institutional chamber in the Confederacy, with no ambassador and no council and no ceremony, and read a list he didn't need to look at in a flat administrative voice for 4 hours and 17 minutes, until 600 beings from 8 species forgot how to breathe. Not as a performance. Not as a demonstration, just as what it was, a record, an honest account of one ordinary human's 11 ordinary years. She thought about what Voreth Kess had written in the ruling. We are granting the request because the alternative is to pretend we did not hear the record. We cannot do that. And she understood, finally, what the chamber had understood in its wordless, collective way, long before the ruling, long before the final entry. The most terrifying thing in the room had not been the number. Been the voice. The same voice at entry 1 as at entry 241. The same measured, unhurried, careful voice. No pride in it, no grief, no performance of either, just documentation. Just a person accounting for what they had carried and what they had done and what they would continue to do, with or without an audience, with or without recognition, with or without anyone in the room understanding what they were witnessing. Siren Vel closed the file. She did not title it differently. She left it as it was, what we did not understand. She thought that was probably the most accurate thing she had ever written. Because the understanding she'd arrived at, the understanding the chamber had arrived at, the understanding the Scarith command had arrived at too late, was not a comfortable thing to carry. It wasn't the kind of understanding that resolved into clarity. It resolved into something else. Something that sat in the chest with a particular weight in the quiet hours, when the work was done and the calculations were finished and the frameworks had been reviewed and updated and filed. It was the understanding that somewhere, right now, there were humans she hadn't counted and couldn't count, in places that hadn't made it into any Confederacy archive, doing the same quiet, unwitnessed, unhurried work. building lists they didn't need to look at, carrying names. Getting better, year by year, not because the war was going well but because that was the direction they moved in when it wasn't. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the fastest or the most advanced or the most numerous, but because they were the species that had, at some point in their long and bloody history, looked at the concept of stopping and decided, not dramatically, not with speeches or proclamations, but in the quiet, practical, administrative way that Davenroe read a list in a flat voice for 4 hours and 17 minutes, decided that stopping was simply not one of the available options, and the galaxy was going to have to decide what to do with that. The Confederacy's registration system eventually processed Roe's military citations. The list of decorations was long. He was contacted for a formal ceremony of recognition, which was a significant event in Veltian institutional culture, an occasion of considerable ceremony and public weight. He didn't attend. He was, according to his unit's deployment records in the field, he was still working.